Hello, fuck. Oh, right. Gavin Stanford. Shelley Snob is still on vacation. Hopefully she comes back with a little common sense. She's a bit on the derpy end. Don't tell her I said that. Anyway, welcome to Rocks 95. Tonight we have a wonderfully written script written by our writer Jim Mason, but first, a word from our sponsor.
Tired of feeling alone? Feeling misunderstood? We are here for you. Come join us. Join Void's Light Fellowship. And join a family of outcasts who wish to praise the Void. We love you.
Let's start by looking at the concept of innovating to zero, an ambitious goal to reduce harmful impacts like carbon emissions and environmental degradation to net zero.
And falling all the way to zero. This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3.
At its core, it's about using innovation, new technologies, renewable energy, and policy shifts to solve global-scale problems. But innovation like this doesn't happen overnight. It starts small, incrementally improving over time, just like the initial efforts toward reducing pollution or tackling climate change. Now, shift gears for a moment and think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. In early 2020, the world was hit with a crisis that demanded immediate action, and innovation became crucial. The development of the COVID-19 vaccine was seen as a modern miracle of science, an example of innovation at an unprecedented pace. Within a year, scientists created, tested, and distributed a vaccine to address a novel virus, utilizing new technologies like mRNA that hadn't been applied on this scale before. The parallels between innovating to zero and the COVID-19 vaccine lie in their shared reliance on global cooperation, technological advancement, and an urgency to solve massive problems. Both appear to be well-intentioned efforts to improve human life and survival. But let's take a deeper look. These innovations, particularly the COVID-19 vaccine, raise questions when viewed from another angle, especially when we start considering how they fit within broader, more controversial narratives about global control. Some conspiracy theories propose that the push for mass vaccination and global climate initiatives aligns with an agenda for population control, often referred to as depopulation. The idea is that by addressing overpopulation and other global concerns like climate change or pandemics, an elite class benefits by reshaping society for their own gain. Add to this the enormous profits made by Big Pharma during the pandemic. Pfizer, Moderna, and others raked in billions, benefiting directly from the crisis. While innovation and rapid response were critical, many people began to wonder whether public health took a backseat to profit. And then there's the Epstein case, a chilling example of how power, influence, and control operate behind closed doors. The Epstein list, which links powerful figures across industries to a global trafficking ring, raises further questions about how far the elite will go to maintain power and exploit vulnerable populations. Trafficking, much like the pharmaceutical industry, also revolves around profit, and in these dark spaces, you begin to see how exploitation isn't limited to just one sector. In these narratives, the elites profit both from controlling public health crises and from hidden networks of exploitation. What does it all mean? To some, these seemingly disconnected threads, innovation, public health, global crises, and hidden abuses of power, are all part of a larger system driven by profit and control. As we move forward in this lecture, I want you to consider how innovation, global power structures, and profit motives can sometimes align in ways that aren't always about bettering society, but about maintaining control and generating wealth for a select few. Now let's circle back. Meet Bob, he is important. So without further ado, let's take a moment to dissect the movie Humane in the context of everything we've just discussed: innovation, global elites, depopulation, and profit motives. Humane takes place in a dystopian near future where environmental collapse, economic instability, and overpopulation have forced governments to take drastic measures. The film centers around a family dinner, where the true nature of the government's solution to these crises slowly unravels. It becomes clear that mass euthanasia has been proposed as a way to reduce the global population. A shocking manifestation of what the elites see as a necessary evil to save humanity and the planet. Humane reflects the themes of innovating to zero, but with a dark twist. In the world of Humane, the solution to global problems is not about sustainable technology, renewable energy, or even widespread vaccination. It's about eliminating people, depopulation on a massive scale. The government claims it's the only way to ensure a future for the planet, aligning with some conspiracy theories that propose the global elite is looking for ways to control population growth in the name of solving climate change and resource scarcity. What's more unsettling is the cold, bureaucratic nature of this plan, echoing how large-scale solutions are often framed as inevitable and for the greater good, without considering the ethical ramifications. This directly ties into the notion of how innovation can sometimes be hijacked by those in power. Just like how the COVID-19 vaccine was a rapid innovation in response to a global crisis, Humane presents a different form of innovation, one designed to control who lives and who dies. The vaccine itself, while seen as a life-saving measure, was also criticized in certain circles as part of a broader depopulation agenda, where those in power profit from the crisis. In Humane, there's no pretense of innovation for public good. The state's decision is driven purely by what they deem necessary to maintain control over society and its resources. The movie's subtle critique of the elites parallels the way Big Pharma profited during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Humane, the government and powerful organizations are the ones orchestrating these drastic measures. Just as in real life, we saw pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer and Moderna making astronomical profits. These companies, while undoubtedly providing a solution, became symbols of how crises can be exploited for economic gain. And this mirrors how the elites in Humane orchestrate the population's reduction under the guise of solving a larger problem, with no regard for the individual suffering or ethical dilemmas involved. Let's now touch on the darker, underlying elements of control and exploitation that also surface in Humane. The film's climax, where the true intentions behind the population control measures are revealed, reflects a dystopian version of the Epstein trafficking network. The global elites in the film are portrayed as morally detached, willing to sacrifice others for their own survival and comfort. The Epstein case, where powerful individuals were linked to heinous acts of trafficking and exploitation, serves as a real-world comparison. In both Humane and the Epstein case, the elites thrive off the exploitation of vulnerable people, whether it's through trafficking or, in the film's case, state-mandated euthanasia. It's all about maintaining control and ensuring their own interests are safeguarded, with little regard for the masses. Lastly, in Humane, the ultimate question becomes: who profits from the suffering? Just as Big Pharma raked in billions during the pandemic, the elites in the film are the ones who stand to benefit from the culling of the population. It's the cold calculation of who gets to live and who is deemed unnecessary, much like how conspiracy theories about depopulation agendas argue that the elites profit from these crises by creating systems that disproportionately affect the poor and the marginalized. In conclusion, Humane offers a dark allegory of the same themes we've been discussing: innovation gone wrong, elite control, population reduction, and profit at the expense of humanity. By comparing the film to real-world events like the COVID-19 vaccine and Big Pharma's role during the pandemic, we see how both fiction and reality explore the unsettling idea that innovation and crisis management can, under certain conditions, serve the interests of those in power while justifying extreme measures to save humanity. Whether it's through population control or exploitation, the elites in both narratives are the ones pulling the strings, ensuring their survival and profit, often at the cost of ethics and human life. When we look at the Purge series in comparison to the themes from Humane, the COVID-19 vaccine, innovation, depopulation, and profit-driven elites, the same underlying questions of control, power, and moral decay become glaringly apparent. In The Purge, we're thrust into a world where the government sanctions a night of lawlessness, allowing all crime, including murder, to go unpunished for 12 hours. The reasoning behind this is to allow citizens to release their pent-up aggression and reduce crime for the rest of the year. On the surface, it's framed as a solution to social instability, but as we dive deeper into the series, it becomes clear that it's really about maintaining control over the population and ensuring the survival of the elites. Like in Humane, The Purge presents a solution that is horrific and dehumanizing but packaged as a necessary evil for the greater good. Instead of euthanizing the population to save the environment, as in Humane, The Purge proposes that the government allows the most vulnerable, mainly the poor and marginalized, to be eliminated. The wealthy and powerful, of course, have the resources to protect themselves during the purge, either retreating to secured fortresses or hiring private security forces. This creates a scenario where the elites benefit from the chaos, as it serves to thin out the population of those deemed undesirable, without directly dirtying their hands. In the same way, Humane presents a stark moral divide between those making the decisions and those forced to suffer their consequences. Let's tie this to the COVID-19 vaccine and the broader concept of innovating to zero. Both the vaccine and the climate initiatives under Innovating to Zero are framed as efforts to solve global problems, pandemics and environmental collapse. However, as we've discussed, there are layers of conspiracy around how much the elites might profit or use these crises as opportunities for control. The Purge reflects a similar dystopian view, where solutions presented by those in power are less about saving the population and more about exploiting it for profit and control. The Purge, much like the COVID-19 vaccine conspiracy theories, suggests that the elites create or take advantage of a crisis to thin the population while continuing to profit. In the case of the Purge, the wealthy are not just passive observers. They actively enjoy the benefits of the yearly culling, knowing they will never be the victims. Additionally, the Purge aligns closely with the global depopulation narratives we see in Humane and certain conspiracy theories about COVID-19. Both present a world where reducing the population is seen as a necessary tool for solving larger problems, whether it's the environment in Humane or societal stability in the Purge. But in both cases, it's the poor and vulnerable who are most affected, while the elites manipulate the system to their advantage. The idea of depopulation as a tool for global elites is echoed in the narrative of the Purge, where the wealthy benefit from the suffering of the masses. And what about profit? Big Pharma's profits during the pandemic mirror the wealth generated by the elites during the Purge. In the films, businesses like security companies, weapons manufacturers, and even hospitals thrive because of the annual event. There's a whole economy that revolves around the Purge, just as there is around vaccines and healthcare during the pandemic. The elites, whether in the Purge or the real-world Big Pharma, stand to gain from these crises, proving that even in chaos and destruction, profit reigns supreme. The exploitation of the vulnerable for financial gain, whether through violence, pandemics, or manufactured crises, connects these narratives deeply. Let's not forget the element of trafficking and exploitation, such as in the Epstein case. The Purge series delves into this dark side as well. In several installments, we see people being sold to the rich as targets during Purge night, echoing the concept of human trafficking. The powerful prey on the weak, either by bidding for their lives in a literal sense or by benefiting from a system that allows such exploitation to continue. Like in the Epstein case, where the wealthy participated in hidden, horrific acts for their own pleasure, the rich in the Purge commodify human life. The elites profit from a system built on cruelty, just as in the Epstein trafficking ring, where vulnerable people were sold and exploited. In conclusion, when we compare the Purge to Humane, the COVID-19 vaccine, depopulation theories, and the profits of Big Pharma, a common thread emerges: control by the elites at the expense of the vulnerable. Both the Purge and Humane present dystopian visions of how solutions to global crises can become tools for oppression. Whether it's population reduction, a night of sanctioned violence, or a vaccine conspiracy, the same elites pull the strings behind the scenes, ensuring their own survival and financial gain while leaving the rest of humanity to suffer. The Epstein case only adds another layer to this pattern, where those in power are not just complicit in these systems but actively profiting from the exploitation of others, often behind closed doors. These narratives, both real and fictional, paint a disturbing picture of how innovation and crisis management can be twisted into tools for control and profit. When we look at our current systems, whether it's healthcare, governance, economics, or social structures, there are many disturbing parallels to the dystopian themes we've explored in The Purge, Humane, the COVID-19 vaccine narrative, and conspiracy theories about elite control and depopulation. Take healthcare, for example. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed the rapid rollout of vaccines, which on the surface, were heralded as a triumph of innovation, an effort to save lives and return society to normalcy. But beneath that, many argued that big pharma and global elites exploited the pandemic for enormous profits. Companies like Pfizer and Moderna made billions, leading some to question whether public health or profit was the primary motivator. This mirrors the profit-driven systems in both The Purge and Humane, where the elites either stand to benefit directly from societal crises or create systems designed to ensure their own wealth and survival at the cost of the vulnerable. Looking at our economic systems, we see vast income inequality, with a small percentage of the population, often referred to as the 1%, controlling most of the wealth. These elites can manipulate markets, politics, and even healthcare to their advantage, much like the elites in The Purge, who are protected by their wealth and able to profit from the chaos of Purge Night. In our current system, the rich are not threatened by the same economic downturns or healthcare crises as the average person. They have access to private healthcare, gated communities, and political influence, ensuring they remain unaffected by societal instability. This echoes the idea of innovating to zero, where the powerful may push for policies that benefit them in the name of progress but don't directly benefit the broader population. In terms of governance, just as the Purge government sanctions violence under the guise of societal good, our real-world systems often justify extreme measures in the name of national security or public health. Consider the mass surveillance programs and governmental overreach that have been justified by the need to protect society. These systems of control mirror the dystopian tactics seen in both The Purge and Humane, where the elite-run government uses crises to impose policies that secure their power while leaving the average citizen exposed and vulnerable. Furthermore, the narrative of depopulation as a hidden agenda is not entirely divorced from reality. While we may not have government-mandated population control as seen in Humane, our current systems often disproportionately affect the poor and marginalized. Access to education, healthcare, and even basic survival tools is far more limited for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Global organizations do debate over population, environmental sustainability, and resource depletion, and some have speculated that these discussions could, at their darkest, mirror the plot of Humane, where reducing the population is seen as a viable solution to planetary crises. In reality, it's often the underprivileged who suffer the most from these large-scale problems, while the wealthy remain insulated. When we think about how our current systems exploit the vulnerable for profit, we cannot ignore the Epstein case. The trafficking network that Epstein ran involved powerful figures who operated behind a veil of secrecy, using their wealth and connections to exploit others for personal gain. This mirrors both the literal and figurative exploitation seen in The Purge and Humane, where the vulnerable are preyed upon by the powerful, whether it's for sport, profit, or control. In our world, these same dynamics play out, though perhaps more subtly, in labor markets, criminal justice systems, and even in how humanitarian aid is distributed. There is a deep sense that the most disadvantaged groups are often left out of the systems meant to protect and uplift them, while those at the top continue to profit. Even the conspiracy theories around the COVID-19 vaccine can be seen as a reflection of distrust in these current systems. The idea that the vaccine could be part of a depopulation agenda or profit-driven scheme underscores how many people feel disenfranchised by governments and corporations. This sentiment, that the systems in place do not act in their best interest, is not unfounded. In a world where lobbying, corporate influence, and political corruption are rampant, the average person often feels powerless, much like the characters in The Purge or Humane, who are subject to decisions made by elites who are far removed from their daily struggles. So, when we compare our current systems to the dystopian scenarios in The Purge and Humane, we see striking similarities. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, systems of control and exploitation justified as necessary evils, and an underlying tension between innovation for public good versus profit. Whether it's the healthcare industry, government overreach, or economic inequality, the same dynamics of elite manipulation, exploitation of the vulnerable, and profit-driven decision-making are at play in our real-world systems, just as they are in these fictional worlds. The narratives may be exaggerated or dramatized, but the core realities they critique are all too familiar. The fossil fuel industry, much like Big Pharma, has historically prioritized profits over public safety, contributing to environmental degradation, climate change, and adverse health effects. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, release dangerous chemicals and pollutants, such as carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, and heavy metals like mercury, when burned or processed. These pollutants have been linked to respiratory diseases, heart conditions, cancers, and premature deaths in humans, as well as ecological destruction. Fossil fuel companies have long downplayed or outright denied these dangers, using lobbying power to influence political policies in their favor. Similarly, the pharmaceutical industry has been criticized for prioritizing profit over public health. Take the opioid crisis as an example. Companies like Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin while downplaying its addictive properties, leading to a nationwide epidemic that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. Just as fossil fuel companies hid the true environmental and health costs of their products, Big Pharma has often concealed or manipulated data to downplay the risks of certain medications, contributing to public health crises. Both industries share several key characteristics that highlight their dangers. 1. Manipulation of science and data. Just as fossil fuel companies have funded misinformation campaigns to downplay climate change, pharmaceutical companies have been caught falsifying or selectively reporting clinical trial data. For instance, during the opioid crisis, companies hid the addictive risks of drugs to maximize profits. In both cases, manipulated science has delayed necessary regulations and cost lives. 2. Regulatory capture. Fossil fuel companies and Big Pharma alike have significant influence over government policies due to lobbying power. The revolving door between government regulators and industry executives has allowed both sectors to avoid or minimize meaningful regulations. For example, fossil fuel companies benefit from subsidies and relaxed environmental protections, while pharmaceutical companies benefit from fast-tracking drugs through regulatory agencies without sufficient safety testing. 3. Massive environmental and human costs. Fossil fuels are responsible for vast ecological damage, oil spills, air pollution, deforestation, and habitat destruction, while also contributing to public health issues like asthma, heart disease, and cancer. Similarly, poorly regulated pharmaceuticals have led to drug recalls, lawsuits, and public health crises, like the opioid epidemic or dangerous side effects of drugs that were rushed to market without thorough testing. 4. The externalization of harm. Both industries externalize the true costs of their operations. For fossil fuels, the environmental damage and health impacts of pollution are borne by the public and future generations, not the corporations themselves. For pharmaceuticals, the negative side effects, addiction, and healthcare costs associated with dangerous or overprescribed drugs are borne by patients, not the manufacturers. 5. Disproportionate harm to vulnerable populations. Just as fossil fuel pollution disproportionately affects poorer communities living near power plants or oil refineries, the harms caused by Big Pharma, whether it's through lack of access to affordable healthcare or the promotion of unsafe medications, disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. Marginalized groups, often with less access to healthcare, bear the brunt of dangerous medications or the consequences of pharmaceutical greed. The dangers are clear. In both the fossil fuel and pharmaceutical industries, a lack of accountability and focus on profit maximization leads to harmful consequences for public health and the environment. Both sectors have demonstrated a capacity to hide or manipulate the truth, while those who are most vulnerable suffer the greatest impacts. Recognizing these parallels is important for advocating for stricter regulations and more transparent practices in both industries, ensuring that public health and environmental protection take precedence over profit. Let's now start exploring the COVID-19 vaccine and its connection to the pharmaceutical industry's profits. The pandemic saw companies like Pfizer and Moderna generate massive revenues, with Pfizer alone earning $36 billion from its COVID-19 vaccine in 2021, making it one of the most profitable medical products ever. While the vaccine undeniably played a critical role in controlling the virus, it also raised questions about the driving forces behind such rapid development and distribution. Were public health needs truly the primary motivator, or was it the enormous profit potential that sped up innovation? This leads us to a more complex issue: whether healthcare, especially in times of crisis, has become more about commercialization than care, often leaving marginalized populations vulnerable due to high costs and limited access. This echoes the dystopian themes we've seen in movies like Humane, where control and profit become intertwined with public health and well-being. Now, let's take a look at the concept of innovating to zero, as proposed by Bill Gates. Gates' vision of reducing global carbon emissions to zero seems commendable at first glance, yet the strategies tied to this goal raise concerns. Radical changes in energy, discussions around population control, and a reliance on high-tech solutions are central to this vision. However, much like with vaccine distribution, critics argue that the methods proposed by powerful figures such as Gates often disproportionately affect the poor and developing nations, while the wealthy continue to benefit. It's a dynamic we see mirrored in the dystopian universes of films like The Purge, where societal structures are manipulated by elites to maintain their dominance under the guise of order and progress, often at the expense of the vulnerable. In the real world, the Epstein case offers a direct example of how the elite can operate with relative impunity. Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network, reportedly involving influential figures from politics, business, and even royalty, has revealed the darker side of power. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, many of the details remain hidden from the public, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories. The system protects those in power, much like in dystopian fiction. In both The Purge and Humane, the powerful exploit and manipulate systems while shielding themselves from the fallout. Epstein's case, alongside other real-world abuses of power, reminds us how wealth and influence can allow people to avoid consequences while continuing to exploit others. On a broader scale, the global economic system exhibits similar trends. The wealthiest 1% controls over 50% of the world's assets, and the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while millions faced unemployment, eviction, and health crises, billionaires saw their wealth increase significantly. This mirrors the world portrayed in The Purge, where the rich benefit from societal breakdowns while the poor are left to bear the brunt of the suffering. The systems in place, both in fiction and in reality, seem designed to ensure that those at the top can insulate themselves from the crises that devastate the rest of society. So, the question becomes, what can we do? To challenge these entrenched systems, there are several approaches. Firstly, demanding transparency and accountability from corporations and governments is crucial. Whether it's the pricing of pharmaceuticals or the actions of political elites, public pressure can force change. In the past, boycotts, legal actions, and media exposure have brought about real consequences for those in power. By holding big pharma, politicians, and the wealthy elite accountable, we take a necessary first step toward disrupting the status quo. Policy changes are also critical. Advocating for regulations that curb the excesses of industries that profit from crises, whether it's pharmaceuticals during a pandemic or fossil fuel companies during environmental disasters, can help prevent exploitation. Policies that address income inequality, such as fair taxation, universal health care, and stronger labor protections, can create a more equitable society. Strengthening grassroots movements is another key approach. Local activism has always been at the forefront of challenging systems of oppression. From climate action to healthcare reform, grassroots movements have the potential to unite communities and push for systemic changes from the bottom up. By supporting these efforts, individuals can collectively challenge the elites who hold power over critical resources. We must also advocate for better wealth distribution. Policies that ensure a fairer distribution of resources, such as living wages, affordable health care, and enhanced social safety nets, can help mitigate the gap between rich and poor. Such measures would prevent wealth from being concentrated in the hands of a few while the rest struggle, as we've seen time and time again during crises like the pandemic. Finally, education and awareness are vital. A well-informed public is harder to manipulate. By understanding how these systems operate, from big pharma's profit motives to the political influence of the wealthy, individuals can become more empowered to demand change. Just as dystopian narratives raise awareness about how bad things can get, educating the public about the dangers of unchecked corporate power and wealth inequality can spark movements for real change. In conclusion, while the parallels between dystopian fiction and our current systems are troubling, we are not without agency. By advocating for transparency, supporting policy reforms, and building grassroots movements, we can challenge the structures that allow exploitation and inequality to thrive. Change is possible, but it requires a collective effort to demand accountability and fairness in a system that often seems designed to serve only the most powerful. Let's now turn our attention to Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's final film, which provides a vivid portrayal of power, secrecy, and control within elite circles. At its core, the film revolves around the life of Dr. Bill Harford, played by Tom Cruise, whose seemingly perfect life unravels as he stumbles into a hidden world of masked rituals, wealthy elites, and disturbing moral compromises. Kubrick uses the film as a lens to examine themes of privilege, exploitation, and the vast divide between the public personas of the rich and their private indulgences. Much like the real-world dynamics we've discussed in previous lectures, Eyes Wide Shut reveals how those at the top of the social hierarchy engage in behavior that is not only hidden from the public but also normalized within their insular circles. The film's portrayal of the elite gathering Harford infiltrates echoes the secrecy and impunity of real-world elites, much like the Epstein case we examined earlier. Epstein's trafficking network, and the subsequent revelations about the involvement of powerful figures, share eerie parallels with the masked rituals in Eyes Wide Shut. In both instances, wealth and status serve as shields, allowing the powerful to engage in exploitative practices while remaining untouchable by legal or moral standards. In the movie, these rituals are not just symbolic but act as representations of the lengths the elite will go to maintain control and indulge in their desires, free from consequences. Harford's experiences within this closed society expose him to the sheer scale of manipulation, as seen when his life is threatened simply for witnessing their secretive activities, just as whistleblowers or critics of powerful real-world institutions often face intimidation or silencing. This theme of secrecy parallels the dynamics of global power structures that we've previously explored, whether in discussions of pharmaceutical companies, climate initiatives, or financial inequality. Like the hidden elite in Eyes Wide Shut, the powerful in our world operate behind closed doors, often making decisions that benefit their own interests at the expense of the masses. The way the elites are portrayed in Kubrick's film, detached, unaccountable, and engaged in morally questionable activities, serves as a stark reminder of the imbalance of power in modern society. Much like in The Purge, where the wealthy create systems to maintain their dominance, in Eyes Wide Shut, we see the elite control their world through secrecy, intimidation, and the exclusion of outsiders. In Eyes Wide Shut, Kubrick explores the intersection of sex, power, and manipulation, an idea that ties back to the Epstein case and beyond. The orgiastic rituals in the film represent not only the physical power the elite have but also the psychological control they exert over society. Harford's journey is one of disillusionment, as he begins to realize how little he understands about the forces that truly govern the world he thought he knew. This mirrors our own realization that, behind the facade of public institutions and global organizations, much of the power lies with a small, unaccountable elite. The film doesn't provide clear answers but instead shows how power and privilege create barriers that make it nearly impossible for ordinary people to comprehend, let alone challenge, the systems in place. This secret world is further reflected in the film's use of masks, symbols of anonymity and moral detachment. Much like how corporate and political elites hide behind layers of bureaucracy, legal protections, and carefully curated public images, the masks in Eyes Wide Shut allow the participants to engage in behavior without fear of exposure. In real life, these masks take the form of legal loopholes, non-disclosure agreements, and a compliant media that often fails to hold the wealthy and powerful to account. Whether it's Big Pharma profiting off a global pandemic or the top 1% hoarding wealth during times of crisis, the metaphorical masks shield the elite from scrutiny while the rest of society bears the consequences. Another important layer to Eyes Wide Shut is the theme of complicity. As Harford navigates this strange and morally ambiguous world, he must decide how much he is willing to participate or turn a blind eye. This resonates with our current systems, where many people are aware of the deep inequalities and injustices at play, yet feel powerless or even complicit by inaction. Kubrick forces the audience to confront uncomfortable questions about their own role in perpetuating systems of inequality and exploitation, much like our discussions around healthcare, climate change, and economic disparity. In essence, Eyes Wide Shut compels us to ask, how much are we willing to ignore in exchange for comfort, security, and a sense of normalcy? Much like the dystopian narratives of The Purge and Humane, Eyes Wide Shut presents a society where the elite manipulate systems of power to maintain their control and indulge their desires without consequence. The real-world connections are undeniable, whether through the Epstein case, the disproportionate profits of Big Pharma, or the widening gap between the rich and poor during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. The systems are designed to keep the masses in line, while the elite operate behind closed doors, safe from the moral and legal accountability that governs the rest of society. So, as we dissect Kubrick's vision of secrecy and power, we are left with the same question we've asked throughout these discussions. What can we do? Much like Harford's journey in Eyes Wide Shut, our path forward involves peeling back the layers of secrecy, demanding transparency, and challenging the structures that allow the elite to operate above the law. It requires vigilance, grassroots movements, and policy reforms aimed at redistributing power and resources in a way that serves the many, not the few. While Kubrick's film may offer a bleak view of the world, it also serves as a powerful reminder that awareness is the first step toward change. The more we understand about the systems at play, the better equipped we are to dismantle them. I leave you with one final question. Are you the carbon they want to reduce?